The champagne in my glass sparkled under the restaurant's ambient lighting as I watched James finish his second scotch of the evening. My husband of 18 years looked particularly handsome tonight in his navy suit, the one I'd purchased for his birthday last month. At 48, he still commanded attention when he entered a room, his confidence bordering on arrogance in a way that had once attracted me, but now left me with a hollow feeling in my chest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. To 20 wonderful years, he said, raising his glass toward mine. And to my beautiful wife, Sarah, who's always, been my biggest supporter. I smiled and clinked my glass against his, the sound ringing with a finality I couldn't ignore. The other couples at our anniversary dinner, our closest friends, family members, and several of James's business associates, joined in the toast, their faces bright with the genuine celebration mine only pretended. "Speech," called Robert, James's business partner and oldest friend. The man of the hour should say a few words. I watched as James stood, buttoning his jacket with practiced ease. Something in his demeanor had shifted in recent months, a certain distance, a careful calculation behind even his most casual gestures. After nearly 2 decades together, I could read the subtle changes in his body language like a book, even if I couldn't decipher the story they told. "First, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," James began, his voice carrying that persuasive tone he used during important business presentations. "Having our closest friends and family here to celebrate 20 years with Sarah means more than you know." I maintained my smile, though it felt increasingly brittle as I noticed him glance at his watch, the third time in the last 30 minutes. The weight of the envelope in my clutch suddenly felt heavier. "Sarah and I have built an incredible life together," he continued. "From our humble beginnings in that tiny apartment to where we are now, it's been quite a journey." There was something rehearsed about his words, a careful construction that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. This wasn't the James who had once spoken from his heart, whose enthusiasm for our shared future had been infectious. This was someone performing a role, and performing it well. "Which makes what I have to say next particularly difficult," James said, his tone shifting. The room quieted immediately, sensing the change. "After considerable reflection, I've decided to accept a position with Vertex Systems in Portland." The crystal flute nearly slipped from my fingers. Portland? James had never mentioned a job offer, let alone one in another city. This opportunity represents a significant step forward in my career, but unfortunately, it also means significant changes for Sarah and me personally. My sister Amy reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it tightly as James continued. "After many discussions," he said, though we hadn't had a single conversation about this, "we've decided to separate. Our lives have been moving in different directions for some time, and this transition seems like the natural point to acknowledge that reality." The restaurant seemed to tilt around me, voices fading to a distant hum as I processed his words. Separation? Discussions? The fabrication was so complete, so confident, that for a moment I questioned my own memory. Had there been conversations I'd somehow forgotten? Signs I'd willfully ignored? But no, this was the first I'd heard of any of it. The Portland job, the separation, all of it delivered as a carefully crafted announcement at our anniversary dinner, surrounded by everyone who mattered in our lives. "I know this comes as a surprise," James added, his eyes briefly meeting mine with what appeared to be genuine regret, though I now questioned everything about him. "But I believe this will ultimately be better for both of us." Better. As if humiliating me in front of our closest friends and family could possibly be better for me. I felt 30 pairs of eyes shift in my direction, awaiting my reaction. The script James had written for this moment clearly anticipated tears. Perhaps a dignified exit that would allow him to appear the reasonable one while I became the emotional, soon-to-be ex-wife. Instead, I took a deliberate sip of champagne, allowing the bubbles to ground me in the present moment as I considered my next move. 18 years in corporate finance had taught me to never show weakness in a negotiation. And this, I realized, with startling clarity, was exactly that. James attempting to negotiate the terms of our marriage's end on his terms, in public, to minimize my ability to respond. "How thoughtful of you to share this news with me and our closest friends simultaneously," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside me. "Especially at our anniversary celebration that you insisted on arranging." A flicker of uncertainty crossed James's face, the first genuine emotion I'd seen all evening. This wasn't the reaction he'd anticipated. "Sarah, I thought this setting would be supportive." His words landed flat, even to his own ears, judging by the slight wince that followed. "I see," I replied, folding my napkin carefully and placing it beside my plate. "And the Portland position. When did this opportunity arise?" James shifted his weight, that telltale sign of discomfort I'd learned to identify during countless arguments over the years. "The discussions have been ongoing for a few months. I didn't want to mention anything until it was finalized." "How considerate," I said, reaching for my clutch and extracting my phone. The message notification glowed on the screen. The third from Kevin, my assistant at Mitchell Financial Advisors, the firm I'd built from the ground up while James was launching his software company. "If you'll excuse me for a moment," I said, rising from my chair with more composure than I felt. "I need to take this call." I walked toward the restaurant's entrance, phone pressed to my ear as Kevin's voice came through with uncharacteristic urgency. "Sarah, I'm sorry to bother you during your anniversary dinner, but there's something you need to know immediately." Kevin's voice was tight with concern. "There have been significant withdrawals from your joint retirement accounts over the last 4 months. The most recent one was processed yesterday, $200,000. The floor seemed to shift beneath my feet. Our retirement accounts had been meticulously built over 15 years, the cornerstone of our financial future. "That's not possible," I said, my financial advisor brain immediately calculating the tax penalties and lost growth potential. "Those accounts require dual authorization for withdrawals." "That's just it," Kevin said, his voice dropping. "The paperwork has your signature on it." "But Sarah, I've worked with you for 5 years. Those aren't your signatures. Someone forged them." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The late nights James claimed to be working, the sudden interest in handling our financial paperwork after years of leaving it to me. The new executive assistant he'd hired last year who always seemed uncomfortable around me. "There's more," Kevin continued. "I did some digging after I noticed the withdrawal patterns. The money's been going to an account in Portland under the name of Vanessa Reynolds. I found her on social media. She's the new marketing director at Vertex Systems, the company James is apparently joining." I leaned against the wall, processing this information. Portland, Vertex Systems, the carefully orchestrated announcement. None of it was spontaneous. This had been calculated for months, possibly longer. "How much in total?" I asked, the financial professional in me needing the exact figure. "Just over $1.4 million, Kevin replied. "Almost 60% of your retirement savings." I thanked Kevin, promised to call him in the morning, and ended the call. Standing in the restaurant's elegant entryway, I took several deep breaths, mentally sorting through my options with the same methodical precision I applied to complex investment strategies. James hadn't just planned to leave me. He'd been systematically dismantling our financial future to build a new life with someone else. The Portland job, the separation announcement, these were merely the visible parts of a much larger deception. As I walked back toward our table, I noticed James deep in conversation with Robert, their heads bent together conspiratorially. They straightened abruptly when they saw me approaching. "Everything okay?" James asked, his concern so convincingly portrayed that for a second, I almost believed it. "Just work," I replied with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "You know how it is. Some clients never respect dinner hours." The irony of discussing respect wasn't lost on me as I retook my seat. Around us, conversations had resumed, though they carried the awkward, hushed quality of people discussing a car accident. While driving past it, our friends, or those I had thought were our friends, were carefully avoiding eye contact. James was just sharing more details about the Portland position, my sister Amy said, her attempt at normalizing the situation so transparent it would have been comical under different circumstances. "It sounds like an amazing opportunity." "I'm sure it does," I replied, reaching for my water glass rather than the champagne. I needed clarity now, not the temporary comfort of alcohol. "When do you start, James?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The question was innocent enough on the surface, but my tone carried a weight that made him pause. 3 weeks, he answered, studying my face for clues to my thoughts. The timeline is accelerated, but Vertex wants the transition completed before next quarter. 3 weeks, the same timeline as our banks required notice for large international wire transfers. Not a coincidence, I was certain. "And your living arrangements?" I continued, as if we were discussing a business associate's relocation rather than my husband's abandonment. James hesitated, clearly uncertain about my calm demeanor. "I've found a condo downtown. It's temporary until I get settled." A condo he'd almost certainly visited with Vanessa Reynolds, possibly purchased with our retirement funds. The thought should have devastated me, but instead, it crystallized something that had been forming in my mind since receiving Kevin's call, a strategy taking shape with each new piece of information. "How practical," I said, turning my attention to Robert. "And how is the Seattle office handling James's departure? I imagine there must be significant restructuring ahead." Robert looked startled at being directly addressed. "We're, still working through the transition plan. James has been instrumental to Horizon's growth, as you know." "Indeed," I agreed. 18% annual growth over the last 5 years is impressive by any standard. James shot me a curious look. I rarely discussed specific metrics about Horizon Technologies in social settings, despite having followed the company's progress closely over the years, not just as James's wife, but for reasons he had apparently forgotten. "The executive team is solid," James added, regaining his composure. "The company will continue to thrive." "Under new leadership," I noted, watching his expression carefully. "Robert will be stepping in as interim CEO," James confirmed with a nod toward his partner. "The board's already approved the transition plan." The board, of which I was technically a member, though I'd allowed James to vote my shares by proxy. For years, a convenience that had simplified our lives when my own business was demanding more of my attention. A convenience that, I realize now, had granted him the illusion of complete control. "How convenient that the board could approve such significant changes so quickly," I remarked. "When was the vote?" James's eyebrows drew together slightly, the first sign that my questions were venturing into territory he hadn't anticipated discussing tonight. "Last Thursday. It was a special session. A session I hadn't been notified about, despite my ownership stake." Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. As dinner progressed through its carefully planned courses, I maintained my composure, asking occasional questions about the Portland position and James's transition plan while observing the dynamics around the table. Michelle, my best friend and attorney, was watching me with increasing concern, clearly sensing that something beyond James's announcement was unfolding. Amy kept squeezing my hand under the table, her silent support more valuable than she could know. When the dessert arrived, an elaborate cake with "Happy Anniversary" written in chocolate, the irony was so complete that I nearly laughed out loud. James looked increasingly uncomfortable as I accepted a slice with a gracious smile, as if this were simply another anniversary celebration rather than the public dismantling of our marriage. "Perhaps we should open our gifts before it gets too late," James suggested, clearly eager to move the evening toward its conclusion. "What a lovely idea," I agreed, pulling a small envelope from my clutch and placing it in front of him. "I think you should open mine first." James looked momentarily confused. We had agreed to not exchange gifts this year, or so he had suggested, several weeks ago. Another preparation for this moment, I now realized. He opened the envelope with careful precision, removing a simple card. As he read the contents, his face drained of color. "What is it, honey?" I asked, using the endearment, deliberately. "You look like you've seen a ghost." James cleared his throat, looking up from the card with poorly concealed alarm. "It's just a nice sentiment from Sarah," he said to the table, though no one had asked. Very thoughtful. What the card actually contained was a simple note. "I know about Vanessa Reynolds and the 1-4 million, and you've forgotten who actually owns Horizon Technologies. I have another surprise," I announced to the table, standing with my glass in hand. Since James has shared his news, it seems fitting that I share some of my own. James's eyes widened, silently pleading with me to stop. But the time for private conversations, which he had deliberately avoided, had passed. "Many of you know that I've been considering expanding Mitchell Financial Advisors for some time," I began, addressing our guests with the same confident tone James had used earlier. "What you may not know is that I've recently received an offer to merge with Blackwell Associates, one of Chicago's most respected financial firms. This, at least, was not fabricated for the moment. The offer had been on my desk for 3 weeks, though I had been hesitant to pursue it given James's seemingly settled position in Seattle. That obstacle, it appeared, had removed itself. The merger would create one of the largest independent financial advisory firms in the Midwest, with significant opportunities for growth," I continued, watching James's expression shift from alarm to genuine surprise. "After careful consideration, I've decided to accept their offer, which includes a managing partner position and equity stake." Around the table, expressions ranged from confusion to admiration. Michelle was smiling proudly. She had been encouraging me to consider the Blackwell offer since it arrived. "As for Horizon Technologies," I added, turning directly to James, "I'll be taking a more active role in board governance going forward, rather than allowing my shares to be voted by proxy." Robert nearly choked on his wine. "Your shares?" "Yes," I confirmed with a small smile. "As a founding investor and majority shareholder, I believe it's time I participated more directly in strategic decisions. Starting with a review of last Thursday's board vote, which appears to have been conducted without proper notification to all shareholders." The silence that fell over the table was absolute. Even the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade as everyone processed what I had just revealed. James looked physically ill, his carefully constructed exit strategy visibly crumbling before him. Few people at the table knew the complete history, how my inheritance from my grandmother had provided the initial seed funding for Horizon Technologies when no venture capital firm would take a chance on James's ideas. How I had structured the investment through a family trust that maintained my majority ownership while granting James operational control. How, as the company grew and my own business demanded more attention, I had stepped back from active involvement in Horizon, content to let James be the public face of his success. "Sarah," James began, his voice strained, "perhaps we should discuss this privately." "The way you discussed Portland privately?" I asked, my tone pleasant but firm. Or the way you privately discussed separating? Or perhaps you mean the way you privately discussed withdrawing $1. $4 million from our retirement accounts to fund your new life with Vanessa Reynolds? Gasps and murmurs erupted around the table. James's face flushed deep red, then paled alarmingly. "That's not— I can explain," he stammered, but I cut him off with a raised hand. "I'm sure you can," I said, "and you'll have ample opportunity to do so, with my attorneys present. For now, I think we've imposed on our friend's evening enough." I turned to our guests, who sat in varying states of shock. "Thank you all for coming tonight. While this isn't the anniversary celebration any of us expected, I'm grateful for your support during what is clearly a time of significant transition for both James and me." The carefully chosen words, echoing James's own phrasing from earlier, weren't lost on anyone present. As I gathered my belongings, Michelle approached, her expression a mixture of concern and admiration. "My office, 9 a.m. tomorrow?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "Bring your best corporate and divorce litigation team. We have a lot to cover." As our guests began making awkward departures, James remained seated, seemingly unable to process how completely the evening had deviated from his script. When only he, Robert, and I remained at the table, he finally spoke. "You can't just take control of Horizon," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "The board won't stand for it." "The board," I reminded him gently, "serves at the pleasure of the shareholders. And I own 58% of the voting shares, James. You seem to have forgotten that detail while planning your new life." Robert, looking increasingly uncomfortable, began gathering his things. "I should go," he muttered, avoiding eye contact with either of us. "Actually, Robert, I'd like you to stay for a moment," I said. "As interim CEO, a position that will need to be reconsidered, of course, you should be part of this initial conversation." Robert sank back into his chair, looking like a man facing a firing squad. "Horizon Technologies will continue operations without interruption," I assured him. "I have no interest in destabilizing the company or threatening employee livelihoods. However, there will be an immediate financial audit, and all recent executive decisions will be reviewed by the full board, properly convened this time." James's jaw tightened. "You're punishing me for wanting to move on. This is vindictive." "No, James," I corrected him. "I'm protecting what's legally mine after discovering you've been systematically stealing from our retirement accounts and attempting to circumvent proper corporate governance to facilitate your exit. If anyone's actions are vindictive here, they're yours." I stood, smoothing my dress with steady hands that belied the emotional turmoil beneath my composed exterior. "I'll be staying at the Fairmont tonight. You have until noon tomorrow to remove essential personal items from the house. After that, the security codes will be changed, and access will be through my attorneys only." As I walked away, leaving James and Robert in stunned silence, I felt a strange lightness despite the devastation of the evening. For months, I had sensed something was wrong but had attributed it to normal marriage stresses, to James's work demands, to my own busy schedule. I had ignored subtle signs, rationalized inconsistencies, and silenced my instincts in favor of trust. That trust had been systematically betrayed, not just through infidelity, but through calculated financial deception and an elaborately planned public humiliation. Yet, in executing his careful exit strategy, James had made a critical miscalculation. He had completely forgotten who had made his success possible in the first place. Outside the restaurant, the Seattle skyline glittered against the night sky, the familiar view suddenly representing a chapter closing rather than the backdrop to my established life. As the valet brought my car around, I checked my phone to find 17 missed calls and messages, friends and family reaching out in shocked concern after witnessing the evening's revelations. I would respond to them tomorrow. Tonight, I needed to begin constructing the framework for what came next. The woman who had walked into this anniversary dinner, trusting, perhaps naive, comfortable in a marriage she believed was solid, despite recent distance, no longer existed. In her place stood someone forced to see clearly, to recognize deception, and to reclaim what was rightfully hers. As I drove toward the Fairmont, I realized that while James had been meticulously planning his exit, he had inadvertently created something entirely different: my liberation. The coming weeks would be challenging, the legal battles complex, the emotional terrain treacherous. But for the first time in longer than I cared to admit, I was making decisions based solely on my own best interests, without compromising to maintain a partnership that had clearly meant more to me than to him. By the time I checked into the hotel, a strange calm had settled over me. The clarity that comes from finally seeing truth after prolonged deception. James had spent months constructing an elaborate escape from our marriage, systematically dismantling our shared future to create his new beginning. What he hadn't counted on was that in the process, he would inadvertently catalyze my own new beginning, one where I reclaimed not just financial assets, but personal power he had never anticipated. I would exercise. The Fairmont Hotel suite felt both luxurious and alien as I kicked off my heels and sank onto the edge of the king-sized bed. My evening gown, carefully selected for an anniversary celebration that had turned into something else entirely, now felt like a costume from a play whose script had suddenly changed. I stared at my reflection in the ornate mirror across the room. Outwardly, I appeared surprisingly composed. Makeup still intact, hair still elegantly swept up, posture still straight. Only the tightness around my eyes betrayed the earthquake that had just shattered the foundation of my life. My phone buzzed again. 23 missed calls now. 3 from James, the rest from concerned friends and family who had witnessed the implosion of my marriage over anniversary cake. I silenced it and placed it face down on the nightstand. What I needed now wasn't conversations or explanations. What I needed was information. Comprehensive, detailed information that would allow me to understand the full scope of James's deception and plan my response accordingly. I opened my laptop and logged into our joint financial portal, something I hadn't done in months despite my professional background in finance. James had suggested consolidating our accounts under his login for simplicity's sake last year, a request that seemed innocuous at the time, but now revealed itself as the first step in his elaborate exit strategy. The retirement account withdrawals were immediately apparent. 6 separate transactions over 4 months, each carefully timed to avoid triggering automatic alerts. The forged signatures on the withdrawal authorizations were convincing but detectable to anyone who knew my handwriting intimately. The money had gone directly to an account at Oregon First Bank, an account I had no access to, but was clearly being used to finance James's new life with Vanessa Reynolds. Next, I logged into the Horizon Technologies shareholder portal. As expected, the minutes from last Thursday's special session showed unanimous approval for James's departure and Robert's interim appointment, with my shares voted by proxy despite the fact I'd received no notification of the meeting. The document even included a digital signature purportedly from me, authorizing James to vote my shares. Another forgery, this one potentially constituting securities fraud. I downloaded everything, methodically organizing files into folders, as if this were just another complex financial case, rather than the systematic dismantling of my marriage and financial security. The professional in me took comfort in the familiar process. Gather data, identify patterns, develop strategy. By midnight, I had compiled enough evidence of financial impropriety to justify immediate legal action, not just regarding our marital assets, but potentially criminal charges related to the forged signatures and fraudulent board actions. The revelations should have devastated me emotionally, but instead, I felt an odd, detached clarity, as if the shock had temporarily separated my analytical abilities from my emotional responses. At 12:30 a.m., my phone lit up with a text from Michelle. "You holding up okay? Want me to come over?" I responded simply, "Preparing for tomorrow. Get some sleep. We'll need clear heads." As exhaustion finally began to overtake me, I changed, out of my evening gown and into the hotel robe. The weight of everything, the public humiliation, the financial deception, the years of what now appeared to be calculated manipulation, suddenly crashed over me like a physical force. I allowed myself precisely 10 minutes to cry, setting the timer on my phone with the same discipline I applied to difficult client meetings. When the timer chimed, I wiped my face, drank a glass of water, and returned to the task at hand. There would be time for processing emotions later. Now was the time for strategic action. Michelle's law office buzzed with unusual energy for 9 a.m. on a Saturday. She had assembled her top team as requested: Daniela Okafor, her corporate litigation specialist; Thomas Brennan, who handled high-asset divorces; and Lily Chen, a forensic accountant who consulted on complex financial cases. "Before we begin," Michelle said, closing the conference room door, "are you sure you want to pursue this aggressively? There are less confrontational approaches we could consider." I appreciated the question. Michelle knew me well enough to recognize when action might be driven by emotion rather than strategy. But this wasn't about revenge. This was about protection. James spent months constructing an exit that would leave me financially diminished and professionally blindsided. I replied, my voice steady. "He didn't just betray our marriage. He attempted to systematically dismantle everything I've worked for. So yes, I'm certain." Michelle nodded, satisfied. "Then let's begin." For the next 3 hours, we meticulously reviewed the evidence I'd compiled overnight, supplemented by additional research Thomas and Lily had conducted early that morning. The picture that emerged was even more disturbing than I'd initially realized. Beyond the retirement account withdrawals, James had been quietly liquidating other assets, selling investments from accounts he managed, taking out a second mortgage on our Lake Tahoe cabin without my knowledge, again with forged signatures, and establishing new credit lines using our joint financial information. Total financial exposure appears to be approximately $3 million, Lily concluded, looking up from her spreadsheets. That's not including potential tax penalties for early retirement withdrawals or potential depreciation of the assets he's transferred. "And legally?" I asked, turning to Thomas. "We have grounds for immediate emergency orders to freeze all joint assets," he confirmed. "The forgeries alone constitute fraud. With your position as majority shareholder of Horizon, we can also move for corporate injunctive relief to prevent any further board actions without proper notification and participation." "That's the corporate angle," Daniela added. "The board meeting violations potentially trigger SEC disclosure issues for Horizon, since it's taking on private investment under Regulation D. Those violations could impact company valuation and create liability for officers and directors." I absorbed this information, mentally organizing it into actionable categories. My financial training had conditioned me to separate emotion from strategy, to view complex problems as systems to be navigated rather than crises to be reacted to. That training was now proving invaluable. "Here's what I want," I said, outlining my priorities with the same precision I used when developing investment strategies for high-net-worth clients. First, immediate protection of remaining assets. Second, comprehensive audit of Horizon Technologies, with suspension of James's authority pending investigation. Third, recovery of misappropriated funds, including all penalties and interest. "And the marriage?" Thomas asked gently. "Terminated," I said without hesitation. "But that's secondary. To securing the financial aspects, James can have the divorce he so clearly wants, but not the financial advantage he's attempted to engineer." As the team dispersed to begin drafting necessary documents, Michelle stayed behind, studying me with the concern of someone who had known me for nearly 20 years. "You're handling this with remarkable composure," she observed. "I'm compartmentalizing," I admitted. "The Sarah who's been betrayed by her husband will have her breakdown eventually. But right now, the financial advisor who's been defrauded needs to take control." Michelle squeezed my hand. "Both Sarahs are going to get through this." Before leaving the office, I had signed over 30 documents: emergency petitions, affidavits, corporate resolutions, and powers of attorney. By Monday morning, the legal machinery would be in full motion. But there was something else I needed to do first, something that couldn't wait for formal proceedings. The security guard at Horizon Technologies, downtown Seattle headquarters, recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Mitchell, didn't expect to see you on a Saturday. Mr. Mitchell isn't in today." "I'm not here to see James," I said, swiping my rarely used access card. "I have an appointment with David Chen." David, the company's longtime CFO, had texted me just after my meeting with Michelle, asking to speak privately. His message had been cryptic but urgent. "Things you need to know before Monday. My office, 2 p.m. As I rode the elevator to the executive floor, I prepared myself for what might come. David had been with Horizon since nearly the beginning, one of James's first hires and someone I had always considered a friend, though our contact had become increasingly limited as James insisted on keeping business and personal separate in recent years. Another boundary I now recognized as strategic rather than practical. The executive floor was quiet, most offices dark on the weekend. David's door was open, lights on, his desk covered with files and an open laptop. He looked up as I entered, his expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Sarah," he said, standing quickly. "Thank you for coming." "Your message was intriguing," I replied, taking the offered seat across from his desk. "What couldn't wait until Monday?" David closed the door before returning to his chair. "I'm guessing you're already taking legal action regarding James's situation." "That would be a reasonable assumption." He nodded, seemingly relieved by my candor. "Then you should know that the Portland move isn't just about Vanessa Reynolds, though she's certainly part of it. James has been orchestrating something much larger, a corporate restructuring that would effectively transfer Horizon's most valuable intellectual property to a new entity he's established in Oregon. This was new information, and potentially more significant than the personal betrayal or even the retirement fund theft. "What kind of intellectual property?" I asked, my mind already calculating potential valuations. "The Oracore processing engine, our most significant asset," David said, referring to the proprietary algorithm that formed the foundation of Horizon's most successful products. The plan involves licensing it to the new entity at significantly below market rates, then gradually shifting development resources to Portland until the Seattle office becomes essentially a legacy support operation. The implications were staggering. Oracore represented over 70% of Horizon's projected revenue growth. Transferring it to another entity would hollow out the company while allowing James to retain effective control of the most valuable assets that my initial investment had helped develop. "How do you know this?" I asked, studying David carefully. "Because I refused to cooperate," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "These are the projections James asked me to prepare showing how the arrangement would benefit both entities. When I pointed out that it would devastate shareholder value for Horizon proper, he said that wouldn't be my concern once the restructuring was complete." I opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. The financial models were sophisticated, but transparent to someone with my background. They clearly showed a controlled demolition of Horizon's value while building a parallel company with extracted assets. "The board approved this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The board hasn't seen these projections," David confirmed. "They approved a strategic alliance with a Portland-based technology partner without full disclosure of the relationship or financial implications." He hesitated before adding, or James's personal connection to the new entity's marketing director. When was implementation scheduled to begin? Monday, David said grimly. Initial paperwork is prepared. I was instructed to execute the first transfers next week. I sat back, processing this information. James hadn't just been planning to leave our marriage. He'd been systematically preparing to strip value from the company I'd helped build, transferring it to an entity where my ownership stake wouldn't apply. The retirement account theft was merely a side benefit to the larger corporate heist he'd orchestrated. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked directly. "You've worked with James for 15 years. David looked uncomfortable, but resolute. "Because it's wrong. Not just legally questionable, but ethically indefensible. You funded this company when no one else would. The fact that you've been a silent partner doesn't erase that." I studied him, weighing his motivations against the evidently genuine discomfort he displayed. "Would you be willing to document this formally? Sign an affidavit regarding what you've told me?" "Already prepared," he said, producing another folder. "Complete with supporting documentation and my formal resignation letter, effective immediately if the transfers proceed as planned." As I left Horizon's offices 30 minutes later, the full scope of James's deception had expanded beyond anything I had initially imagined. This wasn't just a husband leaving his wife for another woman. This was a meticulously planned corporate extraction disguised as a personal transition, designed to leave me with an empty marriage and a hollowed-out company, while he relocated with both our retirement savings and Horizon's most valuable assets. The calculated nature of it all, the timing, the layered deceptions, the careful legal maneuvering, revealed a side of James I'd never seen in 18 years of marriage. Or perhaps more accurately, a side I'd glimpsed but rationalized away, attributing his occasional ethical flexibility to entrepreneurial necessity rather than fundamental character. As I drove back to the hotel, my phone rang through the car's speaker system. Amy's name flashed on the dashboard display. After a moment's hesitation, I answered. "Are you okay?" My sister's voice filled the car, tight with concern. "I've been trying to reach you since last night." "I'm functioning," I replied honestly. "Still processing, but taking necessary steps." "What can I do? Mark and I can be there in 20 minutes if you need company." "Actually," I said, making a decision, "I do need something, but not company. I need you to go to the house and remove anything irreplaceable. The photos from Mom's house, Grandma's jewelry from the safe, my personal documents from the study. James has until noon to collect his things, but I don't trust him not to take items just to hurt me." There was a brief silence before Amy responded. "Already on it. Mark's waiting in the car. Where should we take everything?" "Your place for now. I'll make arrangements for storage next week." I paused before adding, "Don't confront him if he's there. Just get what matters and leave." "Too late for the don't confront advice," Amy said, a hint of grim satisfaction in her voice. I left him a very detailed voicemail last night explaining exactly what I think of men who steal from their wives while planning to run off with someone young enough to be their daughter. Despite everything, I smiled slightly. Amy had always been the more emotionally expressive sister, a quality I sometimes envied in moments when my own measured approach felt more like limitation than strength. "Just be careful," I cautioned. "This situation is more complicated than it initially appeared." "Isn't it always?" Amy sighed. "But don't worry. I'll be surgical, in and out with what matters most." After ending the call, I redirected my route. Instead of returning to the hotel, I found myself driving toward Lake Washington, to the small public park where James and I had often walked on weekend mornings during the early years of our marriage. It was a place of simple, genuine connection, before success had complicated our lives, before separate career trajectories had created space for secrets. I parked and walked to our bench, overlooking the water where sailboats drifted lazily in the afternoon sun. The normalcy of the scene, Families picnicking, couples strolling, dogs chasing frisbees, created a jarring contrast to the dissolution occurring in my own life. Sitting alone on the bench that held so many memories, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what was happening, not just the practical implications or strategic considerations, but the raw personal devastation of betrayal. 18 years of shared history, of building lives together, of believing in a partnership, all revealed as partially illusory, constructed on a foundation that had been steadily eroding beneath the surface. For the first time since James's announcement the previous evening, I cried without a timer. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place beyond conscious control. I cried for the marriage I had believed in, for the future we had planned together, for the trust that had been systematically violated while I remained unaware. An elderly woman walking past paused briefly, concern evident in her expression. "Are you all right, dear?" I managed a watery smile and a nod, unable to explain that I was simultaneously experiencing the worst crisis of my adult life and a strange, emerging sense of clarity that would eventually lead to something stronger. How could I articulate that? In the midst of devastating betrayal, I was already beginning to recognize the opportunity it presented to reclaim aspects of myself that had been gradually compromised during 18 years of partnership. As the tears finally subsided, I watched a seaplane land on the lake, creating ripples that expanded outward in perfect concentric circles. The image seemed profoundly relevant to my current situation. One significant disruption generating waves of change that would eventually touch every aspect of my life. My phone buzzed with a text from Michelle. Judge Patterson signed the emergency orders. Assets frozen effective immediately. Corporate injunction hearing scheduled for Monday 9 a.m. The legal machinery was now in motion. The financial advisor in me knew this was necessary, the only way to protect what rightfully belonged to me while the full scope of James's deception was investigated. But the wife in me, even now, felt a momentary pang at the escalation, at the transformation of an intimate relationship into a legal battleground. That hesitation lasted approximately 30 seconds before my phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from our joint credit card, which I had been monitoring, since discovering the retirement account withdrawals. James had just attempted to charge $12,000 at a jewelry store in downtown Seattle. For Vanessa, undoubtedly. The attempted charge was declined. The emergency freeze was already working. I could almost picture James's confusion, the dawning realization that his carefully constructed exit strategy was encountering unexpected obstacles. The image didn't bring satisfaction exactly, but it did reinforce the necessity of the protective measures now in place. As the sun began its descent toward the Olympic Mountains, casting long shadows across the lake, I finally left the park bench and returned to my car. The emotional release had been necessary, but now it was time to refocus on practical matters. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new information, new decisions to make. Back at the hotel, I found a delivery waiting, a suitcase containing clothes, toiletries, and personal items, packed by Amy and delivered by hotel staff. The note attached read simply, "Got everything important. The house is secure. Stay strong. Love you." I took a long shower, washing away the physical remnants of one of the most challenging days of my life. As the hot water soothed my tense muscles, my mind continued to work. Processing, planning, analyzing options with the same methodical approach I applied to complex financial strategies for my clients. By the time I emerged, wrapped in the hotel's plush robe, a new clarity had begun to form. This crisis, while personally devastating, was ultimately a financial and legal problem to be solved. And solving complex financial and legal problems was quite literally what I did for a living. James might have orchestrated what he believed was a perfect exit, designed to leave me with an empty marriage and diminished assets while he began a new life, enriched by both our retirement savings and Horizon's intellectual property. But in focusing so intently on the extraction, He had made a critical miscalculation. He had completely forgotten who he was dealing with. Sunday morning brought a flurry of activity. Michelle arrived at 8 a.m. with coffee and pastries, along with updated legal documents requiring my review and signature. The emergency orders had successfully frozen joint assets, but James had apparently attempted access through multiple channels overnight, trying credit cards, investment accounts, even attempting an online transfer from our home equity line of credit. "He's getting desperate," Michelle observed as she reviewed the activity log, "which means he's dangerous. We need to consider what he might do next." "He'll approach Robert," I said immediately. "Try to accelerate the intellectual property transfer before the corporate injunction takes full effect." Michelle nodded. "Daniela's already at Horizon's offices with the corporate counsel. They're securing servers and restricting access to key systems pending the hearing tomorrow." I raised an eyebrow. That was fast. "Your majority shareholder status makes it possible," Michelle reminded me. Once we presented the documentation of potential fraud and unauthorized board action, corporate counsel had no choice but to cooperate. As we reviewed the next steps in the legal strategy, my phone rang. James's name appeared on the screen. "You should take it," Michelle advised, "but keep it brief and non-specific, and put it on speaker." I answered with a simple, "Hello, James." "What the hell have you done?" His voice was tight with barely controlled fury. "My cards are declined, accounts frozen. I can't even access my own company." The phrasing was telling, "my own company," revealing how completely he had internalized ownership of something that legally belonged primarily to me. "I've taken appropriate measures to protect assets pending full investigation," I replied evenly. "Your attorney can contact Michelle Rodriguez to discuss next steps." "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You're overreacting to what should be a straightforward separation. I was going to be generous in the settlement offer." "Generous?" I interrupted, unable to maintain complete neutrality at such a blatant mischaracterization. "Is that what you call stealing $4 million from our retirement accounts and attempting to transfer Horizon's intellectual property to your new entity in Portland?" The momentary silence confirmed what I had suspected. He hadn't anticipated that I knew about the corporate extraction plan. "Who've you been talking to?" he finally asked, his tone shifting from indignation to calculation. "The better question is who I'll be talking to next," I replied. "The SEC has strict disclosure requirements regarding related party transactions and potential conflicts of interest for corporate officers. I wonder how Vertex Systems will feel about their new hire once those discussions begin." Another silence, longer this time. "Sarah?" he finally said, his voice lowered to the persuasive tone he used when attempting to negotiate from a weakened position. "We should discuss this privately. There's no need for regulatory involvement or legal escalation. We can work something out that benefits both of us." Michelle was shaking her head emphatically. "All discussions will go through legal counsel from this point forward," I stated firmly. Given the extent of financial misappropriation and corporate governance violations already documented, there's nothing to be gained from direct communication. "You don't want to do this," James warned, abandoning persuasion for veiled threat. "A public legal battle will damage Horizon's value, hurt the employees who depend on the company, and destroy everything we've both worked to build." It was a manipulative attempt to use my sense of responsibility against me, to make me feel that protecting my own interests would harm innocent bystanders. "That's an interesting perspective," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Particularly from someone who is planning to hollow out the company while establishing a competing entity. If you're concerned about Horizon's employees, perhaps you shouldn't have planned to transfer the assets their livelihoods depend on to your new venture in Portland." The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line suggested this direct acknowledgement of his plan had hit home. "How did you—" He stopped himself, regrouping. "Whatever David told you is being taken out of context. The strategic partnership would have benefited both entities. "Save it for the deposition, James," I said, finding unexpected strength in direct confrontation. "Your attorney has my attorney's contact information. Goodbye." As I ended the call, Michelle studied me with open admiration. "That," she said, "was masterful. You didn't give him anything he could use while making it clear you know exactly what he's been planning." I set the phone down, surprised by my own composure. "He's always underestimated me," I observed. "Even now, he can't quite believe I've put all the pieces together without his guidance." "That's his fatal flaw," Michelle agreed. "And our greatest advantage." By Sunday afternoon, the initial shock had begun to transform into purposeful action. The legal team had drafted comprehensive documentation for Monday's injunction hearing. Eleanor Wilson, my former boss and mentor, had agreed to step in as interim CEO at Horizon, pending full investigation of corporate governance violations. The financial forensics team had already traced several of the retirement account withdrawals to specific purchases, including a down payment on a waterfront condo in Portland's Pearl District and a 2023 Range Rover registered in Vanessa Reynolds' name. As evening approached, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called Amy and asked her to bring me the keys to the house. "Are you sure?" she asked cautiously. "James might still be there." "He's not," I assured her. "Hotel security informed me he tried to access my room earlier but was turned away. He's staying at the Olympic Hotel downtown, according to the credit card alert I just received." 2 hours later, I stood in the foyer of what had been our home for the past decade, a modern waterfront property in Madison Park that James had insisted we needed as his professional stature grew. The house had always felt more like his space than ours, designed to impress colleagues and clients rather than create comfort. Standing there now, I realized how much of our shared life had gradually shifted to accommodate his preferences, his priorities, his image. I moved through the rooms methodically, noting what Amy had already collected and identifying additional items I wanted to secure. In the home office, James's desk drawers hung open, contents hastily rifled through. The safe behind the bookcase stood ajar, emptied of everything except documents he'd deemed unimportant, including, ironically, the original investment agreement, establishing my majority ownership of Horizon Technologies. In our bedroom, no, the bedroom, I mentally corrected myself, the closet told its own story. James had taken all his custom suits, designer shoes, and the collection of watches he'd accumulated as symbols of success. What remained were empty hangers and the lingering scent of the cologne he'd worn for years. The master bathroom revealed another small betrayal. The prescription bottles for my occasional migraine medication had been emptied, the contents presumably taken by James, who suffered from similar headaches but refused to see a doctor for his own prescription. Even in this final extraction, he had taken what wasn't his without consideration. I should have felt devastated standing in the hollowed-out shell of my marriage, seeing the physical evidence of James's calculated departure. Instead, I felt an unexpected sense of clarity, as if the space, stripped of his dominating presence, was allowing me to see it objectively for the first time. This house had never truly been mine. It had been a stage for the life James wanted to project: successful entrepreneur, community leader, philanthropist, roles that required the right setting, the right backdrop for his performance. I had adapted to the space rather than shaping it, compromised my preferences for harmony, accepted his vision as the price of partnership. Standing in the kitchen where we had shared thousands of meals, celebrated milestones, navigated challenges, I realized that the dissolution of our marriage wasn't just an ending. It was potentially a beginning. A painful, unwanted, devastating beginning, but a chance to reclaim aspects of myself that had been gradually compromised during 18 years of accommodation. I collected what I had come for: additional financial documents, irreplaceable photographs, the first business plan I'd written for Mitchell Financial Advisors that James had professionally framed when I received my first major client. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something on the entrance table. James's anniversary gift to me, still in its wrapped box with elegant silver paper and a card attached. For a moment, I considered leaving it untouched, a symbol of the celebration that had transformed into confrontation. But curiosity overcame hesitation. I opened the card first, reading James's handwriting, confident strokes forming words that now seemed almost cruelly ironic. To 20 years of partnership and the journey ahead, with deepest appreciation for all you are. Love, James. Words. Written by someone who had already withdrawn $1. $4 million from our retirement accounts, established a relationship with another woman, and planned a complete exit from both our marriage and the company we had built together. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. I unwrapped the box to find a diamond bracelet, elegant, expensive, and utterly impersonal. The type of gift selected for its monetary value rather than sentimental meaning, chosen to impress observers rather than connect with its recipient. After 18 years, James still gave gifts that reflected his image rather than my preferences. I closed the box and returned it to the table, leaving it behind as I walked out the front door. There would be practical decisions to make about the house eventually, whether to sell it, maintain it as an asset, or let James buy out my equity as part of the inevitable settlement. But those were tomorrow's problems. Tonight, as I drove back to the hotel with the essential remnants of my married life packed in 2 small boxes, I was beginning to understand that while James had orchestrated what he believed was a clean exit from our marriage, he had inadvertently given me something unexpected: the opportunity to reclaim my authentic self after years of incremental compromise. The road ahead would be challenging. Tomorrow's injunction hearing would officially transform private betrayal into public legal battle. The financial implications would require months to fully unravel. The emotional aftermath would demand processing I hadn't yet begun to undertake. But as I watched Seattle's skyline light up against the darkening sky, I felt something I hadn't anticipated in the midst of such upheaval: a quiet, growing determination not just to survive this crisis, but to emerge from it stronger, clearer, and more authentically myself than I had been in years. James had spent months constructing what he believed was the perfect extraction from our marriage, from financial obligations, from the company whose success he had come to view as entirely his achievement. What he hadn't factored into his careful calculations was the possibility that in attempting to diminish me, he might accidentally set me free. Monday morning arrived with the crystalline clarity that often follows life's most devastating storms. I stood before the bathroom mirror in my hotel suite, applying makeup with the same methodical precision I'd used to organize financial evidence the night before. The woman reflected back at me appeared remarkably composed, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that conveyed authority without aggression, hair styled in a sleek chignon, expression calm despite the circumstances. Only the slight shadows beneath my eyes betrayed the emotional earthquake I'd experienced over the weekend. This controlled exterior wasn't merely performance, it was armor, protection against the public nature of the battle that lay ahead. Michelle arrived at 7:30 a.m., bringing coffee and her characteristic blend of professional focus and personal concern. "Ready for this?" she asked, studying my face carefully. "As ready as possible," I replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "How's the team?" "Prepared and positioned. Daniela's already at the courthouse filing additional documentation. Thomas is meeting with the financial forensics team for last-minute updates. David Chen arrived at my office an hour ago with additional evidence of James's planned IP transfer." I nodded, appreciating the military precision with which Michelle had orchestrated our response. In the 48 hours since James's public announcement of our separation, we had assembled an arsenal of legal and financial documentation that transformed personal betrayal into actionable legal claims. The emotional devastation remained. Of course, a background radiation that colored everything, but it had been temporarily contained, channeled into strategic purpose. "And James?" I asked, the name still catching slightly in my throat despite my efforts at detachment. Michelle's expression hardened slightly. "His attorney filed emergency motions this morning attempting to challenge the asset freeze. Pretty standard counter moves, nothing unexpected. They're also requesting a separate hearing regarding Horizon's governance, arguing that your involvement represents a hostile action against established management." I almost smiled at the irony. Hostile action. That's rich coming from someone who forged signatures to vote my shares without notification. "Exactly," Michelle agreed. "Their defensiveness suggests they know how vulnerable their position is. Speaking of which, we received information this morning that James attempted to access Horizon's secure development servers remotely over the weekend, after the initial corporate injunction was already in place. This didn't surprise me. James had always operated with a sense of exception. Rules applied to others, not to him. It was a quality I'd once mistaken for entrepreneurial determination, now revealed as something far less admirable. "Documenting the attempt?" I asked. "Already done. It strengthens our case for the expanded injunction we're requesting today." As we gathered our materials and prepared to leave for the courthouse, my phone buzzed with a text message. "Eleanor Wilson, my former mentor who had agreed to step in as interim CEO at Horizon. Team assembled. Board members notified. Standing by for court decision." Eleanor's involvement represented another miscalculation in James's exit strategy. He had always underestimated my professional network, viewing my connections primarily through the lens of how they might benefit him rather than as independent relationships I had cultivated throughout my career. Eleanor's willingness to step in, postponing her semi-retirement to help stabilize a company in crisis, reflected bonds of professional respect James had never fully acknowledged. The read to the courthouse passed in focused silence, Michelle reviewing documents while I mentally prepared for the public confrontation ahead. This would be the first time I'd see James since discovering the full extent of his deception. The thought sent a flutter of anxiety through my carefully maintained composure, but I pushed it aside. This wasn't about emotional confrontation. It was about legal protection of what was rightfully mine. Seattle's King County Courthouse loomed ahead, its imposing stone facade a fitting backdrop for the gravity of the proceedings about to unfold. As we approached the entrance, I noticed a familiar figure waiting near the steps. Robert Thompson, James's business partner and presumptive interim CEO, had he succeeded in his plan. Robert spotted us immediately, his expression shifting from worried anticipation to uncomfortable recognition. He hesitated visibly before approaching, his body language conveying the awkwardness of someone caught between opposing forces. "Sarah," he began, his tone carefully neutral. "I was hoping to speak with you briefly before the hearing." Michelle stepped slightly forward, her protective instincts evident. "All communication should go through counsel at this point, Robert." He nodded quickly. "I understand, but this isn't about testimony or evidence. It's..." He glanced around, lowering his voice. "A personal message. From the team." Something in his demeanor, the genuine discomfort, the absence of James's polished manipulation, prompted me to respond directly. 3 minutes, I said, gesturing to a nearby bench. "Michelle stays with us." Once seated, Robert seemed to struggle with where to begin. Up close, I could see the strain of the past 48 hours etched on his face. The same period that had transformed my life had clearly upended his as well. "The development team asked me to tell you they support whatever changes are necessary to stabilize the company," he finally said. "They're concerned about their projects, obviously, but more importantly, they want you to know they had no knowledge of what James was planning with the IP transfer." This spontaneous show of support from Horizon's core team, the engineers, and developers whose innovations had built the company's value, was unexpected but significant. It suggested the possibility of reconstructing Horizon's operations with less disruption than I had feared. "Thank you for telling me this," I said, careful to maintain professional boundaries despite my appreciation. "Their concerns are valid. Please assure them that my actions are focused on protecting the company's intellectual property and ensuring operational continuity. No one's position is at risk except those directly involved in governance violations." Robert nodded, relief flickering across his features. "There's something else you should know," he added, glancing toward the courthouse entrance. "James has been calling emergency meetings with investors all weekend, attempting to secure additional funding to challenge your ownership position. He's telling potential investors this is a temporary misunderstanding that will be resolved quickly." This aligned with what we had anticipated, James attempting to leverage his professional network to counter my legal actions. What surprised me was Robert's willingness to share this information. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked directly. "You and James have been partners for 15 years. Robert's expression darkened. 15 years during which I believed we operated with shared ethical boundaries. Finding out he was planning to transfer our core technology without full board disclosure violated that trust, and learning how he's handled personal finances." He shook his head. "There are lines you don't cross no matter how successful you become." As we stood to continue toward the courthouse, Robert added one final comment. "For what it's worth, many of us are ashamed we didn't see what was happening. You deserved better, both personally and professionally." The unexpected validation momentarily threatened my carefully maintained composure. I managed a brief nod of acknowledgement before Michelle gently guided me toward the courthouse entrance, where Daniela waited with our complete legal team. The next 2 hours unfolded with the structured formality that characterizes high-stakes legal proceedings. Judge Patricia Henderson, known for her no-nonsense approach to financial impropriety cases, listened attentively as Michelle and Daniela presented our evidence of asset misappropriation and corporate governance violations. James's attorney, Martin Geller, attempted to characterize the situation as a personal dispute inappropriately elevated to corporate emergency, but his arguments visibly weakened as our documentation of forged signatures and unauthorized transactions mounted. James sat at the opposing table, his expressions cycling between controlled confidence and flashes of genuine alarm as particularly damning evidence was presented. He had chosen his standard power suit, navy blue with subtle pinstripes, his signature red tie providing a splash of assertive color. The familiar outfit struck me as oddly poignant. He was still playing the role of successful CEO, even as the foundations of that identity were being systematically dismantled. Our eyes met briefly during a procedural pause. His gaze held a complex mixture of emotions, anger certainly, but also something that might have been regret, quickly masked by strategic calculation. I maintained neutral eye contact for precisely 3 seconds before returning my attention to the documents before me. Even this minor interaction sent a jolt of confused emotion through my carefully maintained professional exterior, a reminder that beneath the legal battle lay the intimate devastation of betrayal. Judge Henderson's ruling, when it came, represented a comprehensive validation of our position. The asset freeze would remain in place pending full financial accounting. The corporate injunction was expanded to prevent any transfer of intellectual property or adjustment to Horizon's governance structure without court approval. Most significantly, the judge appointed a special master to oversee Horizon's operations temporarily, an independent party who would ensure compliance with her orders while the underlying issues were adjudicated. Additionally, Judge Henderson stated, her tone leaving no room for debate, the court finds sufficient evidence of potential securities violations to refer this matter to the SEC's Enforcement Division for further investigation. This referral does not constitute a finding of wrongdoing, but acknowledges the seriousness of the allegations regarding corporate governance and shareholder notification. The SEC referral clearly shocked James. His posture stiffened visibly as the implications registered. Securities violations could extend beyond civil penalties into potential criminal liability. It represented an escalation he clearly hadn't anticipated when orchestrating his carefully planned exit from our marriage and the company. As the hearing concluded, James attempted to approach me directly, ignoring his attorney's restraining hand on his arm. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said, his voice pitched low but intense. "This is getting out of hand. There are aspects of the situation you don't fully understand." Michelle stepped between us smoothly. "All communication through counsel, Mr. Mitchell." Judge Henderson's orders were quite clear on that point. James's jaw tightened, the muscle pulsing slightly, a tell I recognized from our most difficult arguments over the years. "This isn't just about us anymore," he persisted. "You're putting the entire company at risk with these extreme measures. People's livelihoods are at stake." The breathtaking hypocrisy of his concern, after planning to hollow out the company by transferring its most valuable assets, nearly broke my composure. But years of high-stakes financial negotiations had taught me the value of maintaining calm in moments of confrontation. "You're right about one thing," I replied, keeping my voice steady and professional. "This isn't just about us. It's about financial fraud, forged signatures, and corporate governance violations. If you're concerned about the company's stability, perhaps you should have considered that before attempting to transfer its core intellectual property to your new entity in Portland." The direct reference to his planned IP transfer, something he clearly hadn't anticipated I knew about, visibly shook him. His confident facade cracked momentarily, revealing the calculation beneath. "That's a complete mischaracterization," he attempted, regrouping quickly. "The strategic partnership would have benefited both entities. David Chen has obviously presented an incomplete picture." "The complete picture will emerge during discovery," Michelle interjected firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a company to stabilize." As we left the courthouse, surrounded by our legal team like a protective formation, I caught glimpses of several financial reporters who had somehow learned of the hearing. Michelle had anticipated this, arranging for a member of her firm's PR team to provide a brief, carefully worded statement that acknowledged the legal actions while minimizing specific details. "How did they find out so quickly?" I asked as we moved toward the waiting car. "In situations involving high-profile executives and significant companies, these things rarely stay completely confidential," Michelle explained. "The important thing is controlling the narrative rather than allowing speculation to fill the void." The controlled statement wouldn't prevent coverage, but it would shape how the situation was initially presented, as a legitimate legal action to address financial impropriety rather than a vengeful response to personal betrayal. The distinction was crucial not just for public perception, but for my own professional standing as the situation unfolded. Our next stop was Horizon's headquarters, where Eleanor Wilson was waiting to formally assume interim leadership responsibilities under the court's direction. As we rode the elevator to the executive floor, Daniela provided a quick update on implementation of the judge's orders. "The special master is already on site reviewing financial records," she reported. "IT security has replaced all access credentials for senior management, with temporary authorizations issued according to the court-approved protocol. The development team has been briefed on the situation in general terms, with emphasis on project continuity." The methodical response reflected careful preparation, steps we had outlined over the weekend in anticipation of a favorable ruling. As the elevator doors opened onto Horizon's executive floor, however, the human dimension of the situation became immediately apparent. Employees in the open workspace area fell silent as I walked through, their expressions ranging from shock to curiosity to awkward sympathy. Many had attended company events at our home over the years. Some had been guests at our anniversary dinner just 3 days earlier. Now they were witnessing the complete reconfiguration of both the company's leadership and my personal life in real time. Eleanor met us outside the conference room, her professional demeanor providing welcome steadiness amidst the emotional complexity of the moment. At 65, she carried the confidence of someone whose career achievements were secure, whose reputation was established beyond question. Her willingness to step into this volatile situation spoke volumes about both her personal integrity and her belief in mine. "Security access has been updated according to the court order," she reported. Without preamble, the executive team is assembled in the main conference room awaiting brief. "Any resistance?" Michelle asked. "Nothing overt," Eleanor replied. "Robert Thompson has been surprisingly cooperative. The CFO, David Chen, is obviously relieved to have clearer direction. The only significant pushback came from James's executive assistant, who initially refused to provide access to scheduled meetings and contact protocols. This didn't surprise me. Megan had been hired by James personally the previous year, a replacement for his longtime assistant who had retired after 15 years with the company. I had always sensed a certain coolness from Megan during our limited interactions, but had attributed it to professional boundaries rather than personal loyalty to James. "Her position will need review," I noted, "but that's secondary to operational stabilization right now." Eleanor nodded agreement. "I've temporarily assigned her to marketing support functions while we assess the situation." The executive team meeting that followed was brief and focused, with Eleanor taking the lead as interim CEO. She outlined the court's directives regarding operations during the temporary injunction period, emphasized that day-to-day business would continue without disruption, and established clear reporting protocols under the special master's oversight. Throughout the presentation, I remained largely silent, allowing Eleanor's established executive presence to center the discussion on corporate governance rather than personal drama. The team's response was cautiously professional. Appropriate questions about operational continuity, project timelines, and client communications, with minimal reference to the underlying circumstances that had necessitated these changes. Robert maintained the cooperative stance he had displayed at the courthouse, providing detailed information about ongoing projects when requested. David Chen appeared visibly relieved to be operating under clear legal parameters after months of increasing ethical compromises. Other executives displayed varying degrees of discomfort, but maintained professional focus on their respective areas of responsibility. Only James's head of business development, Alan Parker, displayed open resistance, questioning the legitimacy of the temporary leadership structure and suggesting that James's return would quickly resolve what he characterized as a misunderstanding. Eleanor addressed his objections with the calm authority that had defined her 4-decade career in corporate leadership. The court has established this framework to ensure Horizon's operations continue without disruption, while serious allegations regarding financial impropriety and governance violations are investigated. This isn't a misunderstanding. Mr. Parker, it's a court-ordered corporate intervention based on documented evidence. Your cooperation isn't optional. It's a condition of continued employment. The direct response effectively ended overt resistance, though Alan's expression suggested the battle wasn't over. I made a mental note to review his relationship with James more thoroughly. The vehemence of his defense suggested possible involvement in the planned IP transfer that went beyond simple loyalty. As the meeting concluded and executives dispersed to their respective departments, Eleanor, Michelle, and I remained in the conference room to address next steps. The immediate corporate governance issues are stabilized, Eleanor assessed, but we need to consider longer-term strategy. The Portland entity James established still exists, even if the planned IP transfer has been prevented. And Vertex Systems clearly anticipated his arrival with certain assets in tow. This raised questions about potential external liabilities, commitments James might have made to Vertex Systems or other entities in Portland as part of his planned transition. If he had promised access to Horizon's intellectual property or development resources, those expectations could generate additional legal challenges when unfulfilled. We need a complete audit of all communications between James and Vertex, Michelle agreed. Also, any interactions between Vanessa Reynolds and Horizon's marketing or development teams over the past year. The mention of Vanessa Reynolds, the woman James had apparently been planning a new life with while systematically dismantling ours, sent an unexpected pang through my carefully maintained composure. The financial fraud and corporate governance violations were business problems I could address with professional detachment. The personal betrayal remained a raw wound I had compartmentalized, but not yet begun to heal. Eleanor noticed my momentary discomfort, her expression softening slightly. "This is a marathon, not a sprint," she said quietly. "You've done remarkable work securing the immediate legal protections. The emotional processing can't be rushed." Her acknowledgement of the human dimension beneath the corporate crisis provided unexpected comfort. Unlike many in the business world who preferred to ignore emotional realities in favor of strategic considerations, Eleanor had always recognized that effective leadership required addressing both. "I'm managing," I assured her, straightening slightly. "And having clear purpose helps." "Speaking of purpose," Michelle interjected gently, "we should discuss your ongoing role here during the transition period. As majority shareholder, you have certain rights and responsibilities, but maintaining appropriate distance from operational decisions might be advisable given the circumstances." This represented an important strategic consideration. While my legal standing as majority shareholder was now firmly established, direct involvement in day-to-day operations could potentially be characterized as emotionally motivated rather than business-focused, an impression we needed to avoid as the situation proceeded. "I agree," I said after a moment's consideration. "Eleanor has the executive experience and independence to lead operational recovery. My focus should remain on governance oversight and shareholder protection through the legal process." The discussion continued for another hour, addressing immediate priorities for stabilizing Horizon's operations, while preparing for what would likely be months of complex legal proceedings. By early afternoon, a provisional framework was in place. Eleanor would manage daily operations with the executive team. Michelle's firm would handle ongoing legal strategy, and I would maintain appropriate distance while exercising necessary shareholder oversight. As we prepared to leave Horizon's offices, my phone buzzed with a notification from the security system at our home. Or rather, what had been our home until 3 days ago. The motion sensors had detected activity in the master bedroom. James, apparently, had returned despite the changed security codes. He's used his old emergency key, I realized aloud. I forgot about the spare we kept with his parents. Michelle immediately shifted to protective mode. "Do you want me to send someone?" "Over? We can have a security team there in 20 minutes. I considered briefly before shaking my head. No need for escalation yet. The house is under video surveillance and there's nothing irreplaceable left there. Let's see what he's after. Through the security app on my phone, I accessed the home's camera system, watching as James moved through the master bedroom with purpose rather than nostalgia. He wasn't lingering over shared memories or personal belongings. He was searching for something specific, methodically checking drawers and closets with increasing frustration. The safe deposit box keys, I realized. Suddenly, he's looking for the keys to our bank vault. The safe deposit box at Seattle First National contained backup data drives, original copies of investment documents, and several pieces of jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother, including the rare vintage diamonds James had always insisted would be smart investments to hold rather than wear. "Can he access it without you?" Eleanor asked, watching the video feed with concerned interest. "In theory, no. It requires dual authorization," I explained. "But given what we've discovered about forged signatures, we should assume he's planning something similar," Michelle concluded. "I'll contact the bank immediately to flag the account for enhanced verification protocols." As James continued his increasingly frantic search, his body language revealed mounting frustration. The composed, confident executive who had announced our separation at our anniversary dinner was unraveling, slamming drawers, emptying boxes with careless haste, eventually kicking the closet door in evident fury. Watching this dissolution of his carefully constructed image should have provided satisfaction given the devastation he had caused. Instead, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also an unexpected sadness at witnessing the unraveling of someone I had built a life with for 18 years. The man raging through our bedroom was simultaneously the familiar partner whose habits and expressions I knew intimately, and a stranger whose capacity for calculated deception I had never fully recognized until now. We should secure the safe. Deposit box contents as soon as possible, I decided, turning away from the disturbing video feed. The diamonds alone are worth over $300,000, and the backup data drives could contain information relevant to the financial investigation. Michelle nodded. We can go directly to the bank from here. I've already alerted their security team to expect us and to flag any access attempts from James. As we left Horizon's offices, I took one final glance around the space that represented so much of our shared history, the company we had built from initial concept to successful enterprise, funded by my inheritance and developed through James's undeniable technical vision. Despite everything, I couldn't entirely separate the pride I felt in what we had created together from the betrayal of how he had attempted to claim it exclusively as his own. Eleanor seemed to sense my conflicted emotions as we waited for the elevator. Most companies survive leadership transitions, she said quietly, even difficult ones. The foundation is solid. That's what matters going forward. Her words applied equally to Horizon and to my own life. A reminder that solid foundations could withstand even significant structural damage if properly reinforced and repaired. The thought provided unexpected comfort as we departed for the bank, another step in the systematic reclamation of what James had attempted to dismantle. At Seattle First National, the process of accessing our safe deposit box revealed yet another dimension of James's preparation. According to bank records, he had attempted to access the box the previous afternoon, using what appeared to be my signed authorization. Yet another forged document that had fortunately been flagged due to the emergency protocols Michelle had established through the court orders. The bank manager, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but professionally correct, provided access after verifying my identity through multiple channels. Inside the box, I found the family jewelry intact. He hadn't yet succeeded in removing the valuable pieces that represented not just financial assets, but irreplaceable family history. The data drives, however, were missing. When was the last verified access to this box? Michelle asked the manager crisply. He consulted the access log. Tuesday of last week, Mr. Mitchell accessed the box with proper authorization codes. According to our records, he was here for approximately 15 minutes. Tuesday, the day before our anniversary dinner, when James had claimed to be meeting with clients all afternoon. Another piece of his careful exit strategy falling into place just before his public announcement of our separation. Did the authorization for that visit include removal of contents? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. The manager checked the documentation. Yes. The authorization form indicates permission to remove digital storage devices for backup updating, specifically, routine security protocol for sensitive financial data. James had anticipated potential legal challenges to his exit strategy and had systematically removed evidence that might compromise his position. The missing drives likely contained historical financial records, intellectual property documentation, and possibly communications relevant to his planned transition to Portland. All information that would strengthen our case regarding his premeditated financial and corporate extraction. We'll need certified copies of all access logs and authorization forms, Michelle instructed. These should be considered potential evidence in an active fraud investigation. As we secured the remaining contents and completed the necessary documentation, my phone buzzed with a text message from Amy. James just left the house. looked upset. Taking anything important? I responded briefly. Nothing he can use. Everything valuable is secured. By late afternoon, we had completed the immediate protective measures outlined in our emergency strategy. Legal injunctions in place, corporate governance temporarily stabilized, physical assets secured. Now came the more complex process of fully untangling what James had done and developing a longer-term response to both the personal and professional dimensions of his betrayal. Back at the hotel, Michelle and I reviewed the day's developments, while Eleanor coordinated ongoing operations at Horizon remotely. The immediate crisis management was transitioning into systematic investigation and strategic planning, a phase that would require sustained focus rather than emergency response. "You should get some rest," Michelle advised, noting my flagging. Energy despite determined efforts to maintain composure. "We've established the critical protective framework. The detailed financial forensics and corporate restructuring will take time." She was right, of course. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the initial shock and emergency response was fading, leaving bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. 3 days of emotional devastation, financial investigation, and corporate crisis management had depleted even my considerable reserves. "Tomorrow we'll need to start addressing public narrative management," Michelle continued. "The court filings are already generating media inquiries, and James will undoubtedly attempt to shape perception to his advantage. We should coordinate with Eleanor on a communication strategy that protects both Horizon's market position and your personal professional reputation." The mention of public perception added another dimension to the already complex situation. While the legal proceedings had focused primarily on financial and corporate governance issues, the underlying personal betrayal would inevitably color public interpretation. James had always excelled at narrative management, presenting himself as the visionary entrepreneur whose success came from brilliant innovation rather than collaborative partnership. I had no doubt he would attempt to characterize our separation and the resulting legal actions in terms that minimized his culpability and maximized sympathy for his position. "We need to be strategic without appearing vindictive," I agreed, considering potential approaches. "The focus should remain on documented financial impropriety and corporate governance violations rather than personal relationship dynamics." Michelle nodded approval. "Precisely. Your professional standing in the financial advisory community gives you credibility in addressing the business dimensions of this situation. That's where we keep the emphasis." After Michelle departed, promising to return early the following morning with updated legal documentation, I found myself alone in the hotel suite that had become my temporary home. A transitional space that reflected my current state of suspended animation between what had been and what would be. For the first time since James's announcement at our anniversary dinner, I allowed myself to fully process the personal implications of what had happened. Not just the practical dimensions of untangling 18 years of shared life, but the emotional devastation of discovering that the partnership I had believed in had been systematically undermined by the person I had trusted most completely. The signs had been there, I now realized. Subtle shifts in behavior, unexplained absences, increasing secrecy about financial matters despite my professional expertise in exactly that area. James had begun constructing his exit strategy months earlier, gradually establishing the separate life he planned to step into once all pieces were in place. I had noticed the changes but rationalized them as work stress, midlife restlessness, the natural evolution of a long-term relationship, never suspecting the calculated deconstruction occurring beneath the surface. As I stared out the hotel, window at Seattle's skyline glittering against the night sky, I confronted the painful reality that I hadn't just lost a husband and business partner. I had lost faith in my own judgment. The woman who prided herself on financial acumen and strategic thinking had missed the systematic dismantling of her own life occurring right before her eyes. Yet even as this realization threatened to overwhelm me, another perspective began to emerge. not as emotional comfort but as objective assessment. James's deception had been effective precisely because it was deliberately crafted against my specific vulnerabilities. He had used intimate knowledge of our relationship dynamics to exploit patterns of trust built over 18 years of partnership. The betrayal wasn't a failure of my judgment, but a calculated exploitation of connection, the relationship equivalent of an inside job. This perspective didn't eliminate the pain, but it provided a framework for understanding that separated personal devastation from professional identity. The financial advisor who helped clients navigate complex investment landscapes hadn't failed. She had been specifically targeted by someone with unique access to her blind spots. As this realization solidified, something shifted in my emotional landscape. Not healing exactly, but the beginning of clarity that might eventually lead there. James had spent months constructing what he believed was the perfect exit strategy, designed to leave me with an empty marriage and diminished assets while he began a new life enriched by our joint resources. What he hadn't anticipated was that the very skills he had discounted, my financial expertise, professional network, and strategic thinking, would become the tools of systematic response to his betrayal. In attempting to diminish me, he had inadvertently created the circumstances that would require me to reclaim exactly those aspects of myself that had gradually been compromised during our marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me as I prepared for bed in the unfamiliar hotel room. James's carefully constructed extraction might ultimately prove transformative in ways he never intended. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: public narrative management, ongoing financial investigation, corporate stabilization efforts. The road ahead would be complex and often painful, requiring sustained focus and strategic thinking. But as I finally allowed exhaustion to overcome analysis, I recognized that within the devastating disruption of everything I had believed secure, there existed the possibility of reconstruction that might ultimately prove stronger than what had been dismantled. James had orchestrated what he believed was a perfect exit. What he had actually initiated was my unexpected liberation from patterns of accommodation I hadn't fully recognized, from a partnership that had gradually shifted from mutual support to subtle subordination, from a life designed primarily around his vision rather than our shared priorities. The realization didn't eliminate the pain of betrayal or the practical challenges of untangling 18 years of shared life, but it provided a framework for moving forward, not just surviving James's calculated exit, but potentially thriving beyond it in ways neither of us had anticipated when he stood to make his announcement at our anniversary dinner just 3 days earlier. 3 months after that fateful anniversary dinner, I stood at the window of my Chicago apartment, watching the autumn sun cast golden light across the cityscape. The space felt entirely my own, in a way our Seattle house never had. Contemporary, but comfortable, designed for living rather than impressing, filled with carefully selected pieces that reflected my preferences rather than status considerations. The journey from shattered wife to independent woman had been neither simple nor linear. But standing there in the quiet of a Sunday morning, I recognized how far I had come from those first devastating days after James's announcement. My phone chimed with an incoming message, Eleanor, providing her weekly update on Horizon's operations. Our communication rhythm had evolved into a comfortable pattern over the past months, professional but warm, focused on rebuilding rather than dwelling on the devastation that had necessitated her interim leadership. Q3 projections exceeding revised targets, her text read. Development team has completed security protocol upgrades. Board presentation scheduled for Thursday. You'll join remotely? I confirmed my participation before turning back to the view. The Chicago skyline was still unfamiliar enough to feel like adventure rather than routine, a visual reminder of how completely my life had transformed since accepting the partnership position with Blackwell Associates. The merger of my financial advisory firm with Blackwell had proceeded smoothly despite the personal upheaval, creating one of the Midwest's largest independent financial consultancies with me as managing partner for high net worth client services. The professional transition had provided welcome focus during months of complex legal proceedings and emotional processing. While James had initially fought the asset freeze and corporate governance interventions, his position had weakened dramatically, as forensic accounting revealed the full scope of his financial manipulations. Beyond the retirement account withdrawals I'd first discovered, investigators had identified systematic misappropriation of corporate resources, unauthorized compensation, arrangements, and evidence of planned intellectual property transfers that constituted clear fiduciary violations. Faced with mounting evidence and potential criminal charges, James had eventually agreed to settlement terms that would have been unimaginable during those first chaotic days. The agreement included full restitution of misappropriated retirement, funds with penalties and interest, substantial compensation for legal expenses, and a structured exit from Horizon Technologies that protected the company's operations while removing him from any governance role. Most significantly for James, the settlement included provisions to keep the SEC investigation focused on civil rather than criminal penalties, a concession Michelle had initially resisted but eventually accepted as leverage for more favorable financial terms. "He's avoiding potential prison time," she had noted during our final settlement discussion. "That's worth significant financial concessions from his perspective." She had been right, of course. James had ultimately surrendered far more financially than he might have in a standard divorce settlement, accepting terms that prioritized my interests and Horizon's stability in exchange for mitigated legal consequences. The agreement wasn't about vengeance but accountability, ensuring that the systematic deception he had orchestrated resulted in appropriate consequences rather than the advantageous outcome he had planned. My contemplation was interrupted by another message notification. Amy, checking in about our planned dinner that evening. My sister had been a steadfast presence throughout the turmoil, offering emotional support without judgment and practical assistance without taking over. Her ability to acknowledge the devastation while refusing to treat me as permanently damaged had provided essential grounding during the most difficult periods. "Still on for 7? Mark's watching the kids so we can talk freely," her text read, followed by a characteristic touch of humor. "Though, fair warning, if you order that awful bone broth soup again, I'm legally obligated to stage an intervention." I smiled, typing a quick confirmation. These casual moments of normal connection had become increasingly important as I rebuilt my life. Reminders that while James's betrayal had shattered my marriage, it hadn't broken my capacity for authentic relationship. If anything, the painful unraveling of what I had believed was a solid partnership had clarified what genuine connection actually required: mutual respect, transparent communication, and the courage to see others as they truly were, rather than as projections of what I wanted them to be. The personal growth hadn't come easily. In those first weeks after discovering James's systematic deception, I had cycled through devastating self-doubt about my judgment, painful questioning of our entire relationship history, and profound grief for the future I had believed secure. The professional response had been straightforward: protect assets, establish legal boundaries, secure what was rightfully mine. The emotional work had been far more complex. Dr. Lydia Winters, the psychologist Michelle had practically forced me to contact when the initial crisis response stabilized, had provided invaluable guidance through this territory. Unlike friends who offered well-meaning but simplistic assurances that I would find someone better, or that James would get what he deserved, Dr. Winters had acknowledged the legitimacy of profound loss while helping me recognize the opportunity within destruction. When someone dismantles what you've built together, it's natural to focus initially on what's been taken, she had observed during one particularly difficult session. The deeper work is recognizing what's been revealed, about them certainly, but more importantly about yourself and what you truly need to thrive. That perspective had gradually shifted my focus from what James had destroyed to what I could now create, a life designed according to my authentic priorities, rather than compromises made to maintain partnership with someone whose values had ultimately proven incompatible with my own. The process wasn't about demonizing James, though his actions had certainly warranted severe judgment. It was about honest assessment of a relationship that had gradually evolved from mutual support into something more imbalanced. A dynamic I had participated in through incremental accommodations I had rationalized as necessary compromise rather than recognizing as problematic concession. A knock at the door interrupted these reflections. Michelle had arrived for our scheduled review of final settlement implementation, the remaining legal details requiring attention before I could truly consider that chapter closed. She entered carrying her characteristic combination of legal folders and excellent coffee, her expression reflecting the unique blend of professional focus and personal care that had made her such an essential ally throughout this journey. "Final documentation from the asset transfer," she announced, setting the folders on my dining table. "Once you've signed these, the Lake Tahoe property officially transitions to your sole ownership, and the last of the retirement fund's restoration is complete." The practical mechanics of untangling 18 years of shared life had proven surprisingly complex. Property transfers, account separations, tax implications, corporate governance restructuring. Michelle's team had navigated these waters with remarkable efficiency, transforming catastrophic disruption into organized resolution through methodical legal process. "And James has signed everything required?" I asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. Michelle nodded. "His attorney delivered final certifications yesterday. He's fulfilled all settlement requirements regarding financial restitution and corporate governance separation." "And Vanessa Reynolds?" I couldn't help asking, though I had deliberately minimized attention to James's personal life since focusing on my own reconstruction. Michelle's expression revealed carefully controlled distaste. "According to our sources at Vertex Systems, she's no longer with the company. Apparently, James's diminished circumstances and the public nature of the settlement affected her enthusiasm for the relationship." The information produced complex emotions. Not satisfaction exactly, but a certain sense of cosmic balance. The relationship James had structured his elaborate exit to pursue had apparently dissolved once the financial and professional advantages he had planned to bring to it failed to materialize. I felt no particular vindication in this development, only a sad recognition of patterns continuing to play out according to character rather than circumstance. "And Horizon's leadership transition?" I asked, turning attention to more constructive considerations. "The board approved Eleanor's continuation through next quarter while the executive search continues," Michelle reported. "She's indicated willingness to remain as long as necessary to ensure stable succession." This represented another positive development in the ongoing reconstruction. Eleanor's interim leadership had stabilized Horizon's operations remarkably quickly, reassuring clients, employees, and investors that the company's foundation remained solid despite governance disruption. Her willingness to postpone retirement to guide this transition reflected professional integrity I deeply appreciated. As we completed the necessary documentation, Michelle raised the question I had been considering since approaching the final phase of legal resolution. "Have you decided how you want to handle your majority ownership going forward?" The board restructuring creates several options worth considering. This represented perhaps the most significant decision remaining in the separation of my life from James's. While I had maintained majority shareholder status throughout the crisis to ensure proper governance during investigation and settlement, Horizon's long-term stability would require thoughtful consideration of optimal ownership structure moving forward. "I've been discussing possibilities with Eleanor and the financial advisors," I acknowledged. "Creating a formal governance trust seems most appropriate, maintaining my ownership position while establishing professional management protocols that don't require my direct operational involvement." Michelle nodded approval. "That aligns with what Eleanor suggested might work best for company stability. Horizon has enough value to remain a significant asset in your portfolio, without demanding direct management attention that would compete with your Chicago position. The approach represented a balance I had been working to establish throughout the reconstruction process, protecting what was rightfully mine without allowing James's betrayal to dictate my future priorities through reactive positioning. Horizon Technologies would remain part of my financial portfolio and professional legacy, but not at the expense of the new path I was creating in Chicago. As Michelle departed with the completed documentation, promising to finalize the remaining legal details within the week, I returned to the window, watching the subtle shift in light as afternoon progressed toward evening. The city below bustled with weekend activity, people shopping, dining, connecting, pursuing their individual paths while collectively creating the energy that defined Chicago's unique character. I would soon join that activity, meeting Amy for dinner at the Riverside restaurant we had discovered during her first visit after my relocation. The evening would include good food, better conversation, and the comfort of family connection that had helped sustain me through the most difficult periods of the past months. This normal pleasure, sharing a meal with someone who knew me completely and valued me authentically, had become increasingly significant as I rebuilt daily patterns around what truly mattered rather than what merely impressed. The buzzing of my phone interrupted these reflections, an unfamiliar Seattle number appearing on the screen. Curious, I answered to find Robert Thompson's voice, his tone cautiously professional. "Sarah, I hope I'm not disturbing your weekend. I wanted to reach you before rumors circulated through less reliable channels." My pulse quickened slightly. Robert and I had maintained cordial professional contact throughout the transition, his cooperation during the investigation and settlement process helping to stabilize Horizon during critical periods. This unexpected weekend call suggested development requiring immediate attention. "What's happened?" I asked directly. "James has filed for bankruptcy," Robert replied, his delivery carefully neutral. "Personal, not corporate. The settlement. Obligations combined with apparently significant personal debts exceeded his remaining assets once the corporate separation was finalized." The information landed with surprising impact despite my deliberate emotional distance from James's circumstances. Bankruptcy represented a dramatic fall for someone who had built his identity around entrepreneurial success and financial acumen, AIC, public acknowledgement of failure from a man who had carefully cultivated an image of visionary achievement. "I see," I replied, keeping my tone measured despite the unexpected news. "Is there potential impact on Horizon or the settlement implementation?" "None on Horizon," Robert assured me. "The corporate separation is complete and legally insulated from his personal finances. As for the settlement, Michelle Rodriguez has already contacted me. The financial restitution portions were secured through direct asset transfers that preceded this filing. There may be peripheral issues to address, but the core obligations have been fulfilled." This represented careful planning on Michelle's part, anticipating potential complications and structuring the settlement to ensure my interests remained protected regardless of James's subsequent financial decisions. I made a mental note to acknowledge her foresight when we next spoke. "Thank you for letting me know directly," I told Robert, genuinely appreciating his professional courtesy in what must have been an awkward situation. "There's something else," he added, hesitation evident in his tone. "James asked me to inquire whether you might be willing to meet with him when you're next in Seattle. He was specific about it being a request, not an expectation, and about respecting your decision either way. The suggestion of direct contact after months of carefully maintained separation through legal intermediaries was unexpected. My immediate, internal response was resistance. What possible benefit could come from face-to-face interaction with someone whose systematic deception had devastated the life we had built together? Did he indicate why? I asked, buying time to process my reaction. "Not specifically," Robert replied. just that there are things he feels should be said directly rather than through intermediaries, now that the legal matters are essentially resolved. I considered the request carefully, separating emotional reaction from thoughtful assessment. Throughout the difficult months of investigation, litigation, and settlement, I had maintained focus on practical resolution rather than emotional confrontation. The legal process had addressed the financial and corporate dimensions of James's betrayal with remarkable effectiveness. The personal dimension remained largely unprocessed between us, a deliberate choice that had allowed me to focus on reconstruction rather than recrimination. "I'll consider it," I finally said, neither committing nor refusing outright. "Please, let him know I've received the request and will respond when I've had time to think it through properly." After ending the call, I sat with the complex emotions it had triggered. James's bankruptcy represented a complete reversal of the future he had so carefully planned. The successful executive position at Vertex Systems, the new life with Vanessa Reynolds, the financial security partially built from our shared resources. The architecture of extraction he had designed had ultimately collapsed, leaving him with public failure rather than the fresh start he had envisioned. There was no satisfaction in this knowledge, only a sad recognition of consequences flowing naturally from choices made. The man I had built 18 years of partnership with had systematically betrayed our relationship, attempting to dismantle our shared life for his exclusive benefit. That those actions had ultimately harmed him more permanently than they had harmed me wasn't cause for celebration, but for sober reflection on the nature of character and its relationship to outcome. The request for meeting presented a different consideration entirely. What purpose would direct interaction serve at this point? The practical dimensions of our separation had been resolved through legal process. The emotional damage had been addressed through professional therapy and personal growth rather than confrontation. James's desire to speak directly might represent genuine remorse, manipulative positioning, or simple need for closure, impossible to determine without the meeting itself. As I prepared for dinner with Amy, I set the question aside for more thorough consideration later. Whether or not I eventually agreed to meet with James, his circumstances and requests no longer dictated my priorities or schedule. The woman who had been blindsided at her anniversary dinner had evolved into someone making conscious choices based on authentic priorities rather than reactive positioning or habitual accommodation. Dinner with Amy unfolded with the comfortable rhythm that had characterized our relationship since childhood. Honest conversation balanced with genuine humor, shared memories providing context for current experiences. When I mentioned James's bankruptcy and meeting request, her initial reaction was protective concern. "You don't owe him anything," she stated firmly. "Not explanation, not absolution, not even acknowledgement." "I know," I agreed, appreciating her instinctive defense while recognizing the complexity beneath it. "The question isn't about obligation, but about what serves my own healing process." Amy considered this perspective, her expression softening slightly. "What does Dr. Winters think?" "I haven't discussed it with her yet," I admitted. "Our next session is Tuesday, but I suspect she'll say what she always does, that healing isn't a linear process, and that each decision should be evaluated based on whether it contributes to integration rather than avoidance." Amy smiled slightly at this accurate characterization of my therapist's typical guidance. "Integration rather than avoidance," she repeated thoughtfully. "That's actually helpful framing. Not about what James needs or deserves, but about what allows you to move forward most completely." This perspective, evaluating the potential meeting based on my healing journey rather than James's intentions, provided useful clarity. Throughout the legal proceedings, I had maintained necessary distance to ensure effective resolution of practical matters. Now that those matters were essentially concluded, perhaps there was value in direct conversation, not for James's benefit, but for my own sense of completion. "I'll think about it," I told Amy, genuinely uncertain about the right approach. But not tonight. Tonight is about celebrating the new apartment, your visit, and the fact that the bone broth soup you hate so much isn't actually on the menu anymore. Her laughter lightened the moment, shifting our focus back to present connection rather than past disruption. Exactly the balance I had been working to establish throughout the reconstruction process. By the time I returned to my apartment late that evening, I had reached a tentative decision about James's request. I would agree to a single meeting when my schedule next brought me to Seattle. Not from obligation or lingering emotional attachment, but from recognition that complete healing might benefit from direct closure now that practical matters had been resolved. I composed a brief, clear message to Robert. Please inform James that I can meet briefly when I'm in Seattle for the Horizon Board presentation on Thursday. Suggest a public location convenient to downtown. 1 hour maximum. Setting explicit. Boundaries felt important. Public location for emotional safety. Limited time to prevent manipulation. Clear purpose to maintain focus. The meeting wouldn't be about rehashing betrayal or expressing anger, though those emotions remained valid. It would be about acknowledging reality directly, rather than exclusively through legal intermediaries, a final step in integration before fully closing that chapter of my life. As I prepared for bed, I reflected on the journey of the past 3 months, from devastated wife to independent woman, from reactive crisis management to proactive reconstruction. The path hadn't been linear or simple, with progress and setbacks occurring in unpredictable patterns. There had been days of confidence and clarity followed by nights of profound grief. Moments of emerging strength interrupted by unexpected vulnerability when familiar songs or scents triggered memories of what had been lost. Throughout this complex healing process, I had gradually recognized that James's betrayal, while devastating, had ultimately revealed rather than created fundamental incompatibilities in our relationship. The partnership I had believed in had been partially illusory from the beginning, built on compromises I had rationalized as necessary accommodation rather than recognizing as problematic concession. This understanding didn't excuse James's deception or minimize the destruction his choices had caused, but it did provide framework for moving forward without defining myself primarily as victim of betrayal, allowing me to acknowledge both genuine loss and unexpected opportunity within the same transformative experience. Standing at the window of my Chicago apartment, watching the city lights reflect on Lake Michigan's dark surface, I recognized how completely my life had transformed since that anniversary dinner when James had announced his planned departure. The future I had believed secure had indeed been dismantled, but not in the way he had intended. Instead of leaving me with an empty marriage and diminished assets while he began anew enriched by our shared resources, his carefully constructed extraction had triggered a complete reconstruction that ultimately served my interests rather than his. The irony wasn't lost on me as I considered our reversed trajectories. James had orchestrated what he believed was a perfect exit, only to find himself facing bankruptcy and professional isolation when his plans collapsed. I had experienced devastating betrayal, only to discover unexpected liberation from patterns of compromise I hadn't fully recognized until they were disrupted. This perspective didn't represent satisfaction in another's suffering, even someone who had caused significant harm. It reflected recognition of how character ultimately shapes outcome more powerfully than calculation. How decisions made from selfishness eventually reveal their true nature, regardless of careful planning or strategic positioning. As I finally prepared for sleep, I felt genuine gratitude for the reconstruction journey of recent months, not for the betrayal that had necessitated it, but for the authentic growth it had required. The woman who had been blindsided at her anniversary dinner had evolved into someone more self-aware, more intentional, and more aligned with her genuine priorities than would have been possible without that painful disruption. James had spent months constructing what he believed was the perfect extraction. From our marriage, from financial obligations, from the company whose success he had come to view as entirely his achievement. What he hadn't factored into his careful calculations was the possibility that in attempting to diminish me, he might accidentally set me free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.